Hello, this presentation is about David Hume, the philosopher, and is following a reading of his An Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding as published by Oxford World's Classics in 2007. I've avoided reading Hume, whose dates are 1711 to 1776, until recently, because I have belonged to that tribe which much prefers to read anything in a foreign language than one of the two systematic treatises of philosophy by David Hume, who is probably the classic and definitive type of the English language philosopher. It's well known that Ludwig Wittgenstein refused to read Hume, but we know about this Enlightenment era philosopher from hearsay anyway. We already know about his atheism, his extreme skepticism, and above all his complacent, pompous trust in the type of society he lived in. And Hume's lack of ambition for gaining possession of any ultimate truth, any strenuously attained secret of life, is off-putting to a younger man, as I once was. It's preferable to read any kind of fantastic speculation than to find yourself looking in the mirror to see your own mind in a totally average, rational state. To see a dismissive and realistic man looking back at you like your father, shaking his head, so to speak. But I have been slowly more accepting of this type of the English philosopher, and I've read Hume's mature work of philosophy precisely because I have become more English myself with time, and to some extent I have turned into one of his peers. The religious turn of my life, and my confidence in theology, and a kind of natural national emergency among the English, has made me less bothered about his subtle atheism and more accepting of his brand. What we know most about Hume, even without having read him, is that he was the forerunner of Kant, the German philosopher, and that his doubts about God moved Kant to write his major works, the critiques of practical reason and pure reason. And we do find that Hume's inspiration seems to have been to refute and destroy the scholastic and theological strain of all prior philosophy. Kant is certainly a philosopher everyone should read, and read so as to find metaphysical depth. Kant gave rise to dozens of major philosophical investigations, but Hume only gave rise to Kant. At the very end of this, I will make a very brief summary of Betrand Russell's account of Hume, and we disagree about Hume's importance, but we both can agree, I suppose, that Hume hasn't really been superseded by any English language philosopher. He was a dead end for the English, but Russell says, and I think. Hume appears to have written only two works of formal metaphysics. The first, when he was a young man, which he called A Treatise of Human Nature. And the second, around a decade later, he began work on a revised and shorter version in which his metaphysics has not changed significantly, except it is expressed in a more pleasing and readable way. I'm not interested in the first treatise, which I find boring and badly written, but the second, which he called An Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, is something that one can read and take an interest in. I have just surveyed Betrand Russell's account of Hume in his History of Western Philosophy, and we again take an opposite view. Hume doesn't interest Russell in the later work, which he dismisses altogether. He likes the first one, the boring one. So let's look at An Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding. The first chapter in that book is concerned with the question of whether philosophy can be socially useful or interesting enough to justify a book. Typically, Hume presupposes a certain kind of reader, a certain kind of generally modern British people, the culture, that's to say, of the London of the 1700s. He presupposes a well-ordered country with a class of educated people who are familiar with Rome as well as London, and who think of themselves as modern Roman citizens in a universal civilization. Hume appears, on the surface, to not take philosophy very seriously, except insofar as it represents an opposition to organised religion. That seems to me to be one of a couple of reasons which made him write his book. But he was also motivated by the idea of fame, of literary fame, and he is not shy of telling us in his autobiography that literary fame was something he wanted. And he did expect his books to be received and read widely. But as I say, his principal motivation was to make an attack on organised religion. The failure of his first book, The Treatise of 1739, its failure to be widely read, published when he was only 28 years old, disappointed him, and he refined and changed his ideas only modestly in the second work, The Enquiry of 1748, when he would have been 37. As I've said, what characterises the second book is its fluency, the fluency of its prose, especially when I compare it with the laborious style of other philosophers such as Heidegger or Kant, or the more or less tacit focus of its attack, scholasticism. That's to say, the fluency of this book contrasts very much with the typical style of the scholastic philosophers. Hume's principal idea in the book was to insist that human understanding cannot grasp the first cause or the essential unity of anything which happens in the world. Since he was a determinist, he seems to have believed that there was a way in which all things are joined into a single process, which you might call nature, I suppose, and governed by some kind of law. And yet, he says, mere human beings cannot know what that is. I would point out that this modesty about the human understanding, whether Hume knew this or not, is a consequence of the Christian religious view of existence. For humans are bounded by the divine in Locke, and Locke was the person who had also written his major work, an essay on human understanding, and had made it clear that human understanding is to be contrasted with divine understanding. It makes me wonder whether Hume, who claims to dislike Christianity, if only he had been slightly more intelligent, might have taken the opportunity to study the understanding in itself, as opposed to the understanding of mere humans. But again, he was a man of his time, and a certain sort of rather artificial society prevented him from being as daring as that. And so, accepting that philosophy should only concern itself with human understanding, he set out his view of it as follows. The human mind sees only ideas of things, and not the things in themselves. Anything which can be known is known only as an idea in the mind. And since the human mind can only ever have an acquaintance with ideas, then we can never know the thing in itself, the world in itself. And if we were to attempt to know more than ideas, then we would need to combine several ideas into a synthesis, so as to represent something with which we can't have any direct experience. But the synthesis is beyond human capacity anyway. So both the direct experience and the synthetic collection of ideas both fail to show us the real nature of the world. We only know ideas, and not what we might conveniently call the world itself. There are two sorts of ideas, according to Hume, namely sense impressions, which the mind experiences intensely in the immediate moment, and something which is almost the same, but is less intense, namely memories and concepts, which are both things which are brought to mind, but which are not present in time whilst we know them. But as far as the world in itself As for the world in itself, that is never something the understanding can deal with. And therefore, our understanding deals only with discrete ideas, and these are, all of them, gained from experience, and never from any pre-existing ideas with which we are born. In fact, there seems to be nothing at all that we know which has not been gained by direct experience of life. Therefore, we are not entitled to claim to know anything about the general nature of the world or existence which cannot be shown to have originally been found in direct experience, either in the experience of ourselves or the experience of others who are trustworthy members of our society who can tell us about these things by report. And we are not justified in imputing to the nature of things, or to the first cause of them, namely God, any qualities which are not evident in our experience. This is something Hume is keen to belabor and to spell out in many ways. It's right for us to guess that there is a cause for any effect. So, if the ground is wet outside, we can legitimately claim that it might have been raining. And if we observe the world, we might conclude legitimately that there is a first cause of it which gave rise to it and sustains it. But the nature of that first cause can only be guessed at, based on the effects which it produces and the type of world that we find in our experience. So, crucially for Hume, we cannot say that there is such a thing as justice guiding or building our life and world as its cause, until we have seen evidence that justice does universally prevail here. And if there were to be many instances of injustice in the world at large, then it would be improper to assume that justice, or a guiding hand, is at the cause of our world, and is the thing in itself, perhaps. We have no experience of any first cause, and so it's improper to claim that there is one. In various ways, Hume elaborates on this theme. The Enquiry is a short work, and beyond these basic principles, as I've just outlined them, it doesn't contain a great deal more. But it is as it was said by Locke in his Enquiry, in the preface to the reader, that he will make the same point over and over again, but in different ways, so as to suit the abilities and the tastes of various types of reader, and so as to ensure that the point has been made and proven adequately. But it seems to me that the points which I've just outlined, I've just made, are the content of the book, of Hume's Mature Philosophy. It could be put like this, that we expect a unity, and we feel that there must be a purpose to existence and life, and it is the underlying cause for whatever we experience. But our ideas derived from experience do not contain any unified cause, and how we combine our ideas is something limited to mere contiguity. Our ideas can only be combined, or are only combined, by the nearness and the similarity and the relation of cause and effect between two ideas. We're unable to form a notion of the great first cause. It's not in our means to do so. And we are not born with any knowledge, and we cannot make recourse to prior knowledge. So all of our knowledge is derived from habitual contact with the way things are. We see that time flows in one direction, and that it does so only because we have experience of it doing so. And the apparent laws of nature are only also true because we have grown accustomed to them. We learn what the laws of nature are. It's an interesting aspect of Hume's philosophy that, as a result, he says that at any time in the future, the laws of nature could fail. And we should not think that this was strange, because it's only because of habit, our habitual familiarity with the world as a thing flowing forwards in time in one direction, that we can be sure that it does so. There could be exceptions to this rule at any time. We should not be surprised. I think that there is one large suggestion of some importance, one final point. He says that what we know is not known as a certainty, but rather as a matter of belief. When we are certain of anything, we feel it, rather than know that it is certain. Hume has observed human understanding rather from the outside as an object. As we've seen, the account which Hume has given of the human understanding, he treats the man in a sort of anthropological way. He is looking at men around him, and he takes a little bit of notice of his own inner life. But generally speaking, he is talking about the way that men behave in society, the way that they look at things, and the way that men typically gain knowledge. He has observed himself as an Englishman customarily acts and thinks, and he has described this. This is not entirely dissimilar to the approach taken by the later Wittgenstein, who was always asking himself out loud, how is it that we actually live? How do we actually think in normal life? How do we use language? And he wanted to know how his insights could be expressed and agreed upon by others. You could say that Wittgenstein and the modern school of philosophy in English has continued to do the same thing as Hume was doing, and that this could be the reason why Wittgenstein disliked Hume. They were basically too irritatingly close to one another. And I want to look at briefly Hume's anti-Christianity, and then we'll look at the 12 sections of his short later work, and finally make some concluding remarks about a way forward beyond Hume in English. Hume's anti-Christianity. Everything I say here about his anti-Christianity should be understood in the context that he found himself faced with a powerful church, which is always can be an attractive target for some types of men. And secondly, that he was not allowed, as a consequence of the church's power, to express his atheism in public. I think that Hume, sometimes maybe provocatively, was an atheist. And this is what motivates his philosophy in a similar way that one of his contemporaries, Voltaire in France, was an atheist. I wanted to bring to my response to Hume, I want to bring in my own response to Hume, for I do not find his method or observation sympathetic. And I have read him with some enjoyment, to my surprise. It's not a contradiction. You're able to understand other people's ideas and philosophies with pleasure, whilst not agreeing with them. There are other things to be found in philosophy than simple agreement. My way of approach is not like his or like Wittgenstein's. My approach to philosophy is not like theirs. Here is why. I think that Hume has failed to take into account one obvious and immediate thing, namely his own self. This doesn't go without observation in Betrand Russell, but Russell was even worse than Hume in some respects. Russell did not have a self either. And one of the funny things about selfhood is you can deny that you have one, that you have a self, and nobody finds that offensive or wrong. This is how a philosophy such as Hume's has managed to survive in the world, by a kind of deception. Hume studied the world, and he studied man, but he did not study himself. His primary position seems to be that we have no justification for assuming that there is a unity which we ought to be able to know, but do not. he wants to show that you can't assume that there is a unity. And this unity is kind of another name for the creator and the created world. Men are only able to know about individual single ideas from the experience delivered by their limited senses. And his second position would be that there certainly cannot be a personality or a conscious creator of the world, since there is no evidence in the ideas presented to us by experience of such a creator. I begin from a similar start point, but I observe that there is a unity in existence, namely consciousness itself. We could say the self, your human personality, your human being, is a unity. And I don't mean it's a unity bounded by your physical body. I mean everything that happens only happens through the conduit of consciousness. Consciousness is prior to human understanding, prior to the human. We can say that we choose to become human after we have already become conscious. Just like we can choose to be an Englishman in London after we've excluded other possibilities, because consciousness offers these possibilities to us. I think Leibniz had already made this point in his monadology and the works throughout his life as a philosopher and metaphysician. And he said that the human life and its consciousness and intellect is a single and self-contained substance from which nothing is excluded. The human experience is a single totality. Hume insists that there is no empirical evidence for a conscious or godlike agent underlying and structuring the world in itself. If we treat all the world as a set of effects caused by the first cause, then Hume says the effects do not indicate an intelligent first cause. There might be a completely dispassionate, mindless first cause, for example, just as easily as there might be an intelligent one if we judge by experience alone, experience of the world. And you could think to the Lisbon earthquake. No intelligent God would have done this according to the Voltaire's rationalism, and Hume would have agreed with his empiricism. However, I suggest the obvious fact that there certainly is a personality and an intellect which we can see in the effects accompanying all things, namely my own consciousness. If we look at ourselves, we find an intellect always working, and so it is possible to consider this to be an effect of an intelligent first cause. For reasons which I think are personal to him and to his era, Hume disdained to notice these facts. I mean the facts that their consciousness accompanies everything, and that there is a single total unity, which contains everything. He disdained to notice these facts, but they are delivered by immediate experience to any of us. I cannot exactly claim to have invented them myself either, because immediately after Hume's book reached Germany, Immanuel Kant began thinking along the same lines as I think. Or at least my objections belong to the spirit, if not the letter, of the works of Kant and those who came after him. That is, I'm not too vain to assume that I know more than Hume because I'm some sort of genius. No. I know more than Hume because I know about Hume, and I know about the ideas which were given, which came to light because of him. I don't think there's any question but that Hume wrote his treatise not entirely for dispassionate reasons of knowledge alone. His text makes abusive gestures to the Catholic Church and to the schoolmen throughout. And it concludes, and the conclusion is usually reserved for your summary, it concludes with two sections specifically aimed at refuting ideas of immortality and revealed religion, as well as another against miracles. Hume intended, that is to say, to hold a conversation with the established European Church. In the Oxford World Classics text which I have, the appendix contains several other shorter works which make the same points and are in the same spirit. And it was clearly a fixed idea with Hume that philosophy and religion share the same ground and must do battle. Nonetheless, although Hume and I have religious and epistemic differences, there are philosophical points in his book which have some value, which I will rehearse again, and then I will make a detour through what I consider to be a refutation of Hume. To be fair, I've already given the main points of Hume's book, but I want to look at it in brief, each section by section, and there are 12 sections. And I've also said what I consider to be a refutation of Hume and his purpose, which is an attack on religion. But I want to do it, and it will be quick as possible. The 12 sections of the Enquiry concerning human understanding. I think that studies of the history of philosophy usually fixate on Hume's theory of ideas and how they are twofold. Ideas, he said, are either memories or they are direct, immediate experience. A historical study of Hume, such as Russell made, Betrand Russell, in his History of Philosophy, ought then to proceed to discuss his theory of learning and composing knowledge, which he said is possible when the mind sets about connecting ideas together. And it would point out that these connections are made by habit. After becoming accustomed to a specific cause being regularly followed by an effect, for instance, our minds grow to associate one thing with another. And then we have some knowledge about it. And indeed, Russell's account of Hume is largely taken up with this discussion of cause and effect, I find, after I've composed this essay on paper. The theory of cause and effect which Hume held is meant to deny that there is any pre-existing knowledge or any functions of the mind or understanding with which human beings are born. So, contrary to Socrates, for instance, Hume would say that there are no pre-existing ideas, and that all knowledge derives from experience, and that it is only by custom that we possess any knowledge, and that we have a strong feeling that something is true rather than false, and so certainty is a strong feeling rather than something proven by an irrational process of thought. Socrates, to give an example of the theory of knowledge with which Hume takes issue, Socrates held that everyone learns for himself and rather remembers pre-existing ideas and knowledge. Socrates said that neither teachers nor experience can teach a man anything, but that a man can only help himself to discover what he already knows with the assistance of experience or a teacher, as if knowledge were outside life and time, or that the mind has the task of finding that knowledge in the timeless. The ideas pre-exist. The job of the teacher or experience is therefore more or less just to prompt people to start looking, and according to Socrates, the teacher has the job of making the student enjoy the search and to make the student look for himself. In rough outline, this is one of the arguments for the pre-existence of ideas. Ideas do seem to exist in the eternal world, despite the atheistic claims of Hume and the like. For instance, how do we recognize a tree unless there is a concept of the tree in our mind before its prior appearance before us? You have first to have a notion of trees before you can spot them. And if we say that people learn to have the concept of the tree, they learn to have the idea, then we have to ask, how can you learn an idea? Do ideas seem to be the kind of thing that we can learn? The answer is not clear. Hume's Enquiry has 12 sections. It proceeds from a general discussion of the utility of philosophy in section 1. He says that it has a social purpose since it provides accuracy of thought and it brings society nearer to perfection. And in this way, philosophy does provide an antagonist to religion. Notice that in section 1 he says it can do away with prejudice and superstition. Philosophy can, in addition, bring to light the secret principles of the understanding and the mind, just as Newton had brought to light the principles of the heavens. We've already said that Hume considers ideas, the things the mind works with, are of two kinds, but they both derive only from experience or from impressions. Any idea derived from anything else he dismisses as fake in section 2. In section 3 he explains that ideas seem to him to be combined in only 3 possible ways: by their resemblance, their contiguity or nearness, and the relationship of cause to effect. Section 4 explains that skepticism about all knowledge is the correct attitude towards it, since all knowledge concerns matters of fact. But matters of fact are neither true nor false inherently. If someone states a matter of fact, and somebody else gives the contrary of that matter of fact, there's no way of knowing which one is true, other than from experience. And so everything falls under this condition, including matters which appear to be laws of nature. And generally, any law of nature is a cause for belief, and is not an absolute truth. Every combination of ideas which depends upon cause and effect is contingent on our experience. It has its ground in our experience of it in specific instances, and it cannot be considered a universal and, as it were, an eternal fact. From page 23. When again it is asked, what is the foundation of all our reasonings and conclusions concerning that relation of cause and effect? It may be replied in one word: experience. In section 5, Hume examines the world as we are forced to know it. He says that we live as if the world were unified and lawful, but only because we choose to do so. We do not know that it is. Nevertheless, it is pieced together by cause and effect thinking, which itself is only based on our most up-to-date experiences, and there is no deeper ground to our knowledge. We do not see the world in itself as a whole, or we do not see what it is that indubitably makes a cause precede an effect. This is because the human understanding is only capable of dealing in ideas and not with the thing in itself. So when we assert that something is absolutely true of any fact, this is nothing more than a firm conviction or a feeling or a belief. He then provides us with a general law of the human understanding, namely this: that belief accompanies certain causes and effects, and it does not accompany others. That is, what we consider to be knowledge, due to a combination of ideas, depends upon our belief. In section 6 he asserts that neither freedom of the will nor chance exist. That is, we are not justified by any experience in believing in freedom of the will. This is because our experience shows us that among objects, every cause always seems to produce the same effects, and hence the world appears to be determined. In the next section he says that we have no experience of how human decisions can relate to the physical body, and therefore that the human will is an illusion which does not exist, because power or force and decision do not seem to have any medium in which they can operate. Nobody has ever seen energy or force or will, and they just seem to be convenient ways of speaking about the world, and they may be part of the thing in itself, but they are not facts. And since our ideas derive from sensations and we have no sensation of energy, then it is not part of knowledge. This is no part of knowledge that we can simply accept. The same applies to the human will, or choice and decision about our actions. Hume separates the body from the mind. He kind of thinks of the mind as an epiphenomenon separate from the body, and he shows that the body is predetermined, and so the mind is irrelevant to the activity of the material world. And he discusses how the action of the body as a result of a decision must pass through a sequence of cause and effects, which we cannot understand. If somebody makes a decision to do something, how that happens, that their body or their mind moves in that specific decision toward that decision, nobody can tell. And because he's already said that the world is predictable, then there is no reason not to believe that humans are also entirely predictable in their activity, and that their choices are predetermined for them by circumstances. And he gives instances where if a man is asked to make a decision, he will make a predictable decision, usually for moral reasons. As an example off the top of my head, somebody sees a building which is on fire. A man has only one or two options to make, and a good man will make the effort to put the fire out and get help. So where's the freedom of choice for this man? It's not a convincing argument. But Hume makes it because he's already decided that there is no human freedom. His intention here is to deny both the activity of a supreme being, who would have given human beings freedom, and also to deny the activity of a soul which can choose to do good or evil. Our bodies follow the same laws as everything else, whether those things are inert or living. And he says on page 53, "But are we not equally ignorant of the manner or force by which a mind, even the supreme mind, operates, either on itself or on a body?" Section 8 reaffirms this principle in general terms, proving that human beings follow laws of action. He denies that a man can prove his freedom of will. The world is an immense machine, of which we are simply one small part, page 72. I think that at this point, the moral component, and perhaps the inspiration for the whole book, finally comes to expression, as it moves into what might be called ethical and religious considerations. He points out, for example, that men are no different from animals in that they are creatures of habit and custom, saying, page 78, "Though the instinct be different, yet still it is an instinct, which teaches a man to avoid the fire, as much as that which teaches a bird with such exactness the art of incubation, and the whole economy and order of its nursery." So a man has no choice except to avoid fire. Indeed, Section 9 is concerned with questions about animals, instinct, and the minor differences between humans and animals. Section 10 denies that miracles are possible, since by definition they are impossible. And if a miracle were to occur, then it is the rational man's responsibility to continue to deny that such a miracle ever happened. Seems to be a bit of a circular argument here, which is one worthy of a philosopher. A miracle is to be defined as something which is contrary to nature. So when a miracle happens, it is impossible because it's contrary to nature. Therefore, miracles never happen because they are impossible. The final two sections of the book deal with the afterlife and how Hume prefers the atheist philosophy to any religion. He puts his argument in a dramatic form, as if it was spoken by a friend of his who is an Epicurean. The afterlife is denied since we have no grounds to believe that the human soul is in any way the creation of a conscious plan of the creators. So an afterlife is impossible. He explains this position by saying that we are not justified in presuming an intelligent agent or plan for the world or for humans on any basis other than our experiences, and our experiences do not justify us inferring that such a conscious creator had any intention for us of that kind. Now then, the next and final section of my presentation is my grounds for going beyond Hume's empiricism. It would be impossible to deny that this book is coherent and clear, and that Hume had a good prose style. The book is a classic statement of the empirical British school of philosophy. And if I am right, then a kind of intentional and aggressive anti-Christianity is part of the intention of empiricism. It's almost as if Hume would not have written this book, and certainly would have written it differently, if he did not also want to combat Christianity and the Church. As we have said, there were several major European responses to Hume, made by Hegel, Schelling, Fichte, Kierkegaard, and Heidegger, among others. So answers which tend towards investigations into consciousness itself, which I like to use, are not unknown to us. But I want to make general observations of my own, nevertheless, while remaining aware of those developments. The weakest part of Hume's metaphysics, it seems to me, is the argument for determinism. I can't see how a handful of experiences of cause and effect in nature on physical bodies can justify the idea of the universe being some kind of big clockwork. It is not enough to allow that this is merely a belief that some people have, as Hume would say. We believe it's a big clockwork. Hume has not proven it sufficiently, and it's a big presumption to have made. But more fundamentally, Hume has either by choice or accident ignored his own agency and consciousness in his account of life. We might not be able to see how the mind moves the body, but it simply does so. And there's no instance of anybody, I don't know instances, where I feel I'm being moved by an impersonal force. If we were being strictly empirical, we have to admit that the human mind moves the body. We obviously do seem to have agency, and that is something gained by experience, and is obviously immediately true. We also have a consciousness which is different from the mind and precedes and determines what our experiences will or will not be. We can talk about experience, and yet the consciousness has the power to deny us experiences. We can deny ourselves experiences, or we can find new ones of different kinds. Consciousness clearly precedes experience. There are indeed ways in which consciousness can alter experience, and in a passive and non-destructive way, consciousness may become indifferent to ideas, indifferent to impressions and experience, while still remaining itself, and still performing acts of understanding. This would effectively render empiricism completely redundant as a school of philosophy. The only thing that Hume would be able to return to us to say would be, yes, but we're all Englishmen and stop being so silly. Well, this is not a philosophical argument. Just because other people are doing the same thing doesn't make it true. Furthermore, as already said, if we are looking for a personality inside creation of a unique and dominating type, and we cannot directly see it, we can infer that it exists by seeing such a thing inside experience, namely our own personality. And if we treat this as an effect or a creation made by something else, then we are justified in postulating or speculating about a greater mind which gave rise to it. Consciousness and freedom consistently shape and order life and experience. It is difficult, it's true, to pin down consciousness and to let it see itself. And we have not properly understood what observation of consciousness by consciousness itself can achieve. But it's obvious that with its total freedom, there is a distinction between the awareness which is primordial and grounding, which can, as it were, retreat into the desert of nothing and remain awake, on the one hand, and man, or human understanding and human life and social engagement, which Hume considered to be human, on the other. This goes back to the distinction between God and man, which Locke had made, and which Hume unreflectively takes up, even though he denies that there is a divine component. So Hume, it is plain, expresses the philosophical beliefs of an Englishman who has simply chosen to lead a particular sort of life in a society of peers and so on, and that his philosophy is a discussion between himself and men of his own type, in which they choose to disregard great parts of the evidence which is available to them. In some way yet to be defined, the philosophy which we ought to be doing at a ground level so as to discover universal principles should not confine itself or collapse itself down into human understanding. To speak of human understanding is to have already chosen a form of life, an empirical, sense-based type of knowledge, and to speak of that knowledge with similarly fated men who have also collapsed the wave function, so to speak, and become a standard type with the presuppositions and prejudices which they enjoy. Such humans have a fate, a destiny, a place in history. They're the Englishmen of the 1700s, of the Enlightenment. But latent inside every man is the primordial awareness without any content of a specific kind, which is the potential. In meditation, which is outside the world, a man prepares for life, prepares to assume his role, pares himself down with restraint and learns virtue. It becomes a deeper personality. And the Christians claim that he also is able to communicate with God there. It's simply indubitable that before becoming a standard issue man, consciousness must decide to take on selfhood and become somebody, an individual. It precedes humanity. I can imagine that David Hume would disdain carrying out philosophical experiments into consciousness refinement, which is what I've just spoken about. He would disdain withdrawal from the world, perhaps for moral reasons and perhaps because it does not suit his taste. Yet, if we are looking for the deeper foundations of knowledge and the rules underlying the world, it would be wrong not to take into account the fact that it is possible for men to individually train their consciousness. It would be wrong to deny that some of them claim to receive the Holy Spirit in grace and so on. These things, which are contrary to the spirit of empiricism, nevertheless seem to have some importance when it comes to philosophy and the training of our understanding. How important this kind of religious behaviour is and what it achieves must be discussed elsewhere. There's a relevant point made by Betrand Russell, to whom I will now turn, when he says that, because Russell does also pick up on the fact that Hume denies he has a personality, and Hume apparently said that when he looks at himself, all he finds is a patchwork, hodgepodge chaos of perceptions. This was Hume's total account of human selfhood. Russell doesn't particularly mind this because Russell also wanted to do away with what Hume did away with, which is namely the self. Leibniz had called the self a substance. And there's one of the pages in this History of Philosophy regarding Hume where Russell says the illusion of substance had finally been done away with by Hume. If nothing else at this moment, we can claim that consciousness, which we know to exist immediately, is able to take itself out of the chain of cause and effects, because it is immaterial. And so it has for its object the self in itself. And the Supreme Being can be asserted to have consciousness because we have immediate experience of our own, in our own case. But that our consciousness precedes the mind and experience is all we need to say for now to indicate that it is something which Hume did not discover or care to know about the world. Looking out at the world and at our high knowledge of experience of that world, which is what Hume wanted to do, he missed out the thing which was lying most immediately all around him, the thing which was actually doing the philosophy, his own self, and its freedom and awareness, which are the grounds for everything else. The comments about Russell and his discussion of Hume in the history of Western philosophy. I usually read a philosopher from the past and then consult Russell, who made such an impact on me in my late teens and early 20s. And it's strange these days how I find myself so clearly at odds with Russell. But we won't discuss that anymore, go into any more detail about that. But Russell says about Hume on the first paragraph of his account, "I cannot but hope that something less sceptical than Hume's system may be discoverable." Talking about 200 years later in time, and Russell thinks that nothing has been discovered by English philosophers in the 200 years since Hume, which gives us any more cause to overcome skepticism. Regarding the idea of the self, here he says, Hume has repudiated the idea of the self, and this repudiation of the idea of the self is of great importance. Let us see exactly what it maintains and how far it is valid. To begin with, the self, if there is such a thing, is never perceived. Therefore, we can have no idea of it. If this argument is to be accepted, it must be carefully stated. No man perceives his own brain, and blah, blah, blah. There's like a trivial superficiality in Russell's outlook on life, which was picked up by T.S. Eliot. We don't need to go into these minor details. What's significant about his argument for Hume's empiricism is that Russell always speaks about what we can know, what we cannot know. It does not follow that there is no simple self. It only follows that we cannot know whether there is or not, and that the self, except as a bundle of perceptions, cannot enter into any part of our knowledge. This conclusion is important in metaphysics because getting rid of the last surviving use of the word substance, the last surviving substance. What Russell and Hume both got involved in the game of only allowing something to exist if we can agree on it. There is nothing so impossible to agree upon as the individual life of the isolated individual. This is why they've denied the self, really. It's because amongst two people or three people or a society talking to itself, they simply refuse to allow that one person is more important than the other, when it's clear that there's an infinitely greater value to be attached to the individual who is alive, and each person is in his own sphere living in that way. They basically deny what's staring them straight in the face, but this is how they've managed to do it. This is how they've proceeded. And I've also made a small note on Russell's comparison of Locke with Hume. He says, but having a greater intellect than Locke's, a greater acuteness in analysis, and a smaller capacity for accepting comfortable inconsistencies, Hume arrives at the disastrous conclusion that from experience and observation nothing is to be learned. Notice that Hume is considered to be a far greater mind than Locke. Well, I would like to contest this by pointing something out that something which is glaringly obvious about Hume, which shows his kind of superficiality, and also the fact that Russell missed it shows his lack of acumen as well. It says, in the later portions of the treatise, Hume forgets all about his fundamental doubts, his doubts about cause and effect, his doubts about ideas, his scepticism, and writes much as any other enlightened moralist of his time might have written. He applies to his doubts the remedy that he recommends, namely carelessness and inattention. Now, what Russell misunderstands here is that in the later parts of his works, Hume starts to tell the truth about his real intentions for writing, which were basically to be anti-Christian. This was the primary motivation for his work. Russell finds this strange, and the reason for Hume's extreme skepticism and his denial of the thing in itself is in order to deny the existence of God. There was no other real motivation. It's strange that Russell did not pick up on this, but then Russell himself denied Christianity, and in doing so, he also chose to avoid his own deepest interests. But, as I say, it's as if, well, it's not as if, it is the case that Russell paid lots of very close attention to Hume's minute arguments about cause and effect, about the nature of ideas. But those arguments were only made for the bigger purpose of trying to discredit Christianity. And this is clear from a reading of the text. But it wasn't clear to Russell. But anyway, I'll say no more about it. And this concludes my discussion of David Hume and the Enquiry concerning human understanding of 1748. Thanks for listening.